Hello everybody and welcome to the second day of the UK CRC Tissue Directory Coordination Centre Showcase. Thank you all for coming back as well after our first day. Just a reminder that all the sessions are recorded, so there will be a copy of this afterwards. For any questions, please try and use the Q&A that's available on Hoover rather than the chat, and then we can get that across to you. For any Twitterers, you can use BB Showcase in terms of the hashtag for that. And just to remind everybody, for tomorrow's session, it is going to be an interactive one. And ideally, if you have a Zoom account, pre-log in with those, please, because it will make our life easier in terms of getting you into the right breakout rooms. And just a reminder to do the homework. So this is just trying to look at the topic you've been assigned and the concepts that are available. So thanks again for joining. And once again, thank you to all the sponsors that have sponsored this week of events. It has meant that we've been able to make it free for everybody to join. And today's sponsor is from NBS Scientific. So Samantha is the Senior Marketing Associate there, and she'll just do a very quick introduction to you all. So over to you, Samantha.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Again, my name is Samantha, and today I'm just going to give a brief overview of who we are as a company at NBS Scientific. Next slide, please. So NBS Scientific, we are an innovative company, innovative distributor for the life science industry in the United Kingdom. And we are also part of a global distribution network that values innovation, creativity, quality, and sustainability. And as you can see, some of our current customers include companies like Janssen, Roche, and Charles River Labs. Next slide. So we help biobanks adhere to strict standards by offering products that help preserve sample quality during sample collection, sample processing, sample storage, and sample distribution, virtually the entire biobanking workflow. Next slide, please. So we know that offering or having access to high quality labware is really crucial for preserving sample quality, which is why we offer the full line of Micronic sample storage tubes. Micronic tubes are free from contaminants, they are easily traceable, and they are designed with optimal sealing properties to prevent sample loss. The Micronic portfolio includes both internally and externally threaded tubes ranging from 0.3 ml to 6 ml in size. And they are manufactured from a medical grade virgin polypropylene, which means they have those ideal low binding characteristics for complete sample recovery. Next slide, please. So we also know that having the means to cap, read, identify, and validate samples in the lab is critical. And we strive to fill this need by offering products that enhance sample tracking in the lab. Products like cappers and decappers, 1D and 2D barcode readers, tube labeling systems, and laser markers that can permanently laser etch tubes with any kind of sample ID you might need. Next slide, please. And then finally, to help biobanks preserve sample quality during distribution, we offer two unique products. One of those being the SPL Guard Florida, which is a rack thawing station that can thaw up to 10 racks of tubes in as little as 9 minutes. This is 60% faster than any other instrument on the market. And then for distributing smaller portions of samples, we offer the CXT 353 frozen sample aliquotter, which can be used to generate multiple frozen aliquots from the same frozen parent sample. This eliminates the freeze-thaw cycle and effectively maximizes sample utility. Next slide, please. So overall at NBS Scientific, we really have the products that you need to increase sustainability in your lab. With our high quality labware and innovative lab equipment, you will really have the means to maintain sample quality and traceability throughout the entire biobanking workflow. So this means that you'll never lose a sample again and always have the highest quality specimens to offer researchers. So for more product info, be sure to check out our virtual booth. Thank you for your time. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Samantha. So the next slide, please. So we've got quite a packed agenda for this afternoon. We're going to hear various different perspectives around transparency and sustainability. And then we'll have a bit of a panel session where we can pick up some topics and some Q&A at the end as well. So really hope this is kind of gives you different perspectives to this topic, and we can pick up some interesting debate from it. So just a reminder to use the Q&A on Hoover. As the session goes, we'll do all three presentations, then go to the panel and the questions. So I'd like to introduce Joseph, who's the Medical Director at Mologic Centre for Advanced Rapid Diagnostics, and he's going to give us an overview of some of their work recently. So over to you, Joseph.
Phil, thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation to join you today. I've prepared a presentation around guaranteeing access to rapid diagnostics for epidemics, and normally neglected epidemics, because these are areas that tend to not be global problems. They tend to be sporadic. They tend to suffer from market failures, and they tend to suffer from a lack of interest disproportionate to their health and economic burden. But of course, COVID and the pandemic that has ensued has joined us in the last few months, and many of these epidemics, or certainly this epidemic, is no longer neglected. I've been asked to share an industry perspective on, therefore, the critical role of biobanks from our experience working on high consequence infections and now, of course, COVID. And I've included some of my favorite, if that's the right word, cartoons from Matt, which I highly recommend. The first one, sadly, could just be a real documentation of some of the profiteering that has happened from COVID, and something that we need to be very mindful of as we develop new technologies. Next slide, please. Just a very brief slide about Mologic. Mologic was established in 2003 by Mark and Paul Davis. Paul was one of the co-inventors of lateral flow technology and the original co-creator of Clearblue, the first home pregnancy test. And Mologic spent a few years as the R&D hub for Alere, which is now Abbott, before becoming independent again in 2014. And after becoming independent again, it started working with support from the Gates Foundation on epidemics, in particular malaria and HIV. But this has since expanded to yellow fever, Ebola, dengue, measles, rubella, and several more, and of course, COVID-19. What we created linked to COVID-19 to ensure manufacturing and access were guaranteed, to make sure that R&D alone is not leaving in technology sitting on the shelf, was a new company. It's a spin out from Mologic, but completely delinked and with no shareholders. That's called Global Access Diagnostics. It's dedicated to epidemics, and any revenue, any profit remains in Global Access Diagnostics to invest in epidemics, to bring the price down. And we've managed to bring down the price so far of a triple antibody test to £1.25 per test, and we expect a similar price for the rapid antigen test. And this is important because I hope that the message I can get across here is we have similar challenges in the diagnostic industry, the rapid diagnostic industry, around transparency and sustainability, and sometimes a lack of one or both of these. But being able to create a completely parallel entity that doesn't have to be condemned to those rules has allowed us to go a lot further to ensure access. Next slide, please. Here, just a summary of what I was mentioning earlier, some of the products we're working on. All of these suffer from challenges on biobanking. I think it's one of the most neglected issues and neglected pillars in our sector. And really, this should also be just a slide showing the competition between the hardest epidemics and the hardest samples to collect, particularly well-characterized samples. And just this morning, we were spending a lot of time on onchocerciasis, because river blindness is incredibly challenging to have well-characterized samples. Diagnosis is difficult, and we want to make sure that any cross-reactivity to other pathogens is accounted for in our development program. Yellow fever is another one. And yellow fever, for me, is really a case study for biobanking, because it's a sporadic infection, and it's one that The utmost priority when you detect a yellow fever case is, of course, to reduce cases as quickly as possible. Test, trace, and isolate, much like what we should be doing for COVID-19. And biobanking is often neglected to the detriment of the development of new tools. Next slide, please. Turning to our COVID test, we have two formats at the moment. One is a saliva-based rapid test, and the other is a nose-throat swab, both of which are intended to be easy enough to use for self-swabbing. And our target price, like with the antibody test, is £1. And the challenge we've seen here has been not only, if you like, price touting, with companies approaching groups like ours with very precious samples, particularly at the beginning of the pandemic, sometimes with pricing of $50,000 a sample, but often closer to $1,000. We've also seen very limited forward planning in terms of collecting accessory or alternative samples. And from our perspective, we are incredibly keen to look at a whole array of samples. And that's why we've said when we started this program, saliva or nose or throat swab. But the reality is we're agnostic to the sample. It's really about performance and ease of use. And from our perspective on the COVID testing in the UK, the US were a little bit quicker. But for example, the saliva collection of well-characterized samples and cases still remains extremely poor. Next slide, please. One of the lessons we applied to the challenges we faced was one of responsive manufacturing and combining and partnering our efforts with other sites globally. So here, this is us at Mologic in Bedfordshire, not a very pretty building, but very beautiful countryside. And our colleagues at the Institut Pasteur de Dakar in West Africa are creating a facility separate to ours, but comparable, similar equipment, similar processes, which allows us to be responsive between sites. And one of the items they have always been raising over the years that we've worked with them is having something similar for biobanking, virtual biobanking, sustainable biobanking, particularly for epidemics, because you don't know when they're going to resurface and have another resurgence. Next slide, please. And so what we had to do was create the entity that is now Global Access Diagnostics during the lockdown. So this is in April, gutting the building, May installing the generators, and June installing the equipment. It is a catalyst really for sustainable RDT manufacture, but it's the second facility dedicated to epidemics in this way. And on the next slide, you'll see the first, which is the facility in Dakar. Next slide, please. And this is the vision of Amadou Sall, the director at IPD. You can see the beautiful Art Deco building on the right. And on the bottom, you see a bird's eye view of a desert site, which is where they're building their vaccine manufacturing facility. And on the left, the schematic of the facility they were creating. Next slide, please. And this is it today. Well, actually, this bottom right picture is a couple of months out. But on the left, the founding team, led by Cher Tidiane Diagne, the gentleman on the right of the four on the left. And next component to this is creating a virtual biobank that can complement this facility and ours. And the purpose of that will be having a biobank ready and ensuring that you can generate open reagents based on those so that you can move quickly for epidemics when the next one hits or one of the established ones we know about, like yellow fever, goes out of control. Next slide, please, for just some remarks from our biobanking experience for COVID. Some of the lessons from these market failures that we've experienced in diagnostic development seem to really apply here. And the first one is, what is a fair price? And I think there's an information asymmetry between biobanking entities and developers, and we need some more transparency to understand the necessary costs and the regulation required to maintain a biobank, because I can imagine that it's considerable. Profiteering is rife, particularly in COVID, particularly linked to or exploiting supply chain constraints. We saw that with molecular reagents, which do not cost very much to make, but of course, demand very rapidly outstrips supply. And there were many stories and instances, for instance, in Africa, where laboratories had the ability to pay but were not being prioritised for distribution of those key reagents. And of course, profiteering and poor planning can only prolong the pandemic. Second question is who you can trust. Does a central seal of approval suffice, or do companies like ours prefer to build on established relationships? Certainly for us, very close academic collaboration was key with partners who made available residual samples or created biobanks to answer key research questions, but also to help improve and accelerate the development of new tools that were also needed. And a minority of distributors, primarily advertising samples for extortionate prices, undermines the industry. Just like in the diagnostics industry, stories of providers making available what are actually very low cost tests for £275 or £500 is completely unacceptable. It taints the whole industry. And lastly, is the current model fit for purpose? And from my perspective, the answer has to be no, because despite millions of cases worldwide and hundreds of thousands in the UK alone, this remains a daily challenge. And it's actually, I would suspect, the main limiting factor to much of these developments on our side. So like with responsive manufacturing, we would like to see a paradigm shift in support for biobanks and break down the barriers so that global partnerships can be facilitated from these. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Joe, for that insight. And the point that we first got in contact was obviously when you were reaching out to try and find samples. And so it's great that you'll be able to communicate those experiences to the community here. So thank you for that. And we'll pick up some questions during the panel discussion. So thanks very much again. So we're going to move on. So it's again a slightly different slant to cost recovery. So I'm going to introduce Jamie Stock, who's the Finance and Communications Manager at the UCL BSU, so Biological Services Unit, to give you an idea of how a related but slightly different industry does cost recovery and how that's communicated. So over to you, Jamie. Thanks.
Thank you. And likewise, thank you for inviting me to speak here today. So I'm here to talk about how we achieve cost recovery and ultimately transparency and sustainability in our financial model for biological services, which is essentially the operation of the animal facilities at UCL. If you go to the next slide, please. So biological services is, as I say, we operate 16 animal facilities across 5 campuses at UCL. We have around 150 or more major users and around about 1,500 users beneath that. So we're quite a large operation, covering a large and diverse research base. But we operate as a cost recovery department, quite similarly to many biobanks, I understand. And we have that challenge to achieve the sustainability and transparency. And many of the features of the funding landscape for us are similar. So a number of facilities have been established with block grants that then set the challenge to achieve sustainability over time through recharges. And I'll move to that one. Next slide, please. So in the animal facilities, we offer a number of services. The main one listed here is the housing and husbandry of animals. So this is the means through which we achieve the majority of our cost recovery. The other services listed there, we do have similar cost recovery methods, but the majority for us is on the housing and husbandry, so that's where I will focus today. Next slide, please. So as a university, we are subject to what is referred to as the transparent approach to costing or TRAK methodology. So this is a scheme that was devised by government with what was HEFCE and now the Office for Students, to bring about and introduce a degree of transparency and reassurance for funders in what each university is including in the costs of their research. So this provides us with the framework which we work with to calculate the charges for our housing and husbandry services. And there is, animal facilities are a mandatory facility to be included as TRAC. There is the option for some facilities to not be listed as TRAC. The difference being that with UKRI funded grant work, the full economic cost can be charged if you are TRAC listed. If you're not TRAC listed, then only direct costs are allowed. There's three key elements to the methodology, which I'll talk about in a second, but these are mainly around the operational costs, equipment costs, and the overheads for operating a facility. Next slide, please. So, the first step in our calculations of cost recovery are to look at what is our capacity for offering services. This is really a key element of TRAC where, and cost recovery, I think more generally, where it's a really, it will make a big difference to users, to funders, and in terms of understandability and the transparency that ultimately the cost recovery model provides. For us, in an animal facility, we have two options generally that we make use of. Either the cage capacity is used, or that can be translated into capacity for actual animals. The next step is to identify relevant costs. So these are costs that are relevant to the service that's being provided. So for us, for example, wouldn't include something like the cost of actually buying an animal from an external supplier, because that's something that we recover through different means. But it would include things like the veterinary services, diet, bedding, and all our technical salaries for providing those services. The next step is to have a look at the equipment costs. We're quite fortunate that TRAC affords us the opportunity to base our equipment costs on the going replacement cost as opposed to the actual purchase cost. This is a really helpful thing for our sustainability, because over the expected lifespans of many pieces of equipment that we're working with, which would be in the 15 to 20 year window, those costs can change quite significantly. New technologies can be introduced, and this allows us to maintain pace with the marketplace. But essentially the costs of equipment are then spread across the expected lifespan based on the replacement cost, and that's our annual cost for equipment. TRAC provides some very strict rules on the overhead side. So this for us would mean the general costs of much of the university's infrastructure, including things like the finance function, HR function, estates and maintenance costs, as well as other costs like the building depreciation and maintenance of the fabric of buildings. This is all identified at an institutional level and then distributed based on a weighted space allocation. So under the space allocation rules, there are certain weightings. So in an animal facility, we are considered very clean lab space, which is more expensive than general lab space, which is more expensive than office space, which is more expensive than storage space, just for a basic understanding there. And these three elements are then combined to provide an estimate of the full economic cost of providing that service for a year. Next slide, please. For us, following on from identifying the planning capacity, we then identify the appropriate cost drivers. So actually at UCL, we use the number of animals per day, but many other facilities might use the number of cages per day or the number of cages per week to recharge for the services. But ultimately, the aim is to achieve something that's easy for users to understand, simple to apply, both in terms of charging and costing, and ultimately is fair to the users. So is granular enough to reflect the actual services that the users are receiving, but not overly broken down so as to complicate the system and make it very difficult to understand. Ultimately, for UCL, we opted to break our costs down into the number of animals per day, partly because of the welfare concerns. So there are other factors that can be taken into account because this is something that will affect user behaviour. So we opted to choose animals per day on the basis that if we shifted to cages, then there may be a motivation for users to overcrowd cages with animals, which may not be a benefit for the actual welfare of those animals. So on that basis, we stuck with the animals per day. Once you have identified those cost drivers, then we can divide the full economic cost by those. So if we are expecting to have 3,000 animals in our facility over 365 days, simply share the costs across those to get a daily recharge rate. One complication here for the system is that sometimes it's very difficult to allocate costs to an actual service. So for example, we might have animal diet that is used for both mice and rats, and working out exactly how much of that food has been used for mice and how much has been used for rats is an impossibility on a regular basis. Similarly, the staff in one facility may well be looking after a multitude of species, and how they spend their time is not immediately obvious. So we use a proxy, so we make equivalences for all of the species to a mouse, and a mouse being the majority of the animals at UCL. That provides the basis for dividing those costs. TRAC requires us to review this every 3 years, and that's achieved through a time and motion study to understand how staff are spending their time, and much more in-depth cost analysis to calculate how much diet, for example, is used for mice as opposed to rats, and so on and so forth for all our costs. Next slide, please. So I've just included a brief example here of to provide some visibility on exactly how these costs might look. So this is a completely made up facility, but if you imagine the number of cages is a fixed number in the facility because it is simply what equipment you have. So say there are 1,000 cages. What we would not do is base our costs on all of those cages being full. Just in the general operation of the facility, it's generally no more than 70% full. So we use that as the planning capacity. So 70%, so say 700 cages. Across 52 weeks, if we are going to calculate a cage per week price, that means 36,400 is our capacity for offering the service. Imagine operational costs of 180,000, that might be 100,000 in salaries, 20,000 on vets and 60,000 on equipment servicing and consumables and any other costs. The equipment replacement costs, in this example, we're imagining there's a replacement cost of £240,000 for all the equipment in the facility. And on average, each of those pieces of equipment has an expected lifespan of 15 years. That provides us with equipment costs of £16,000 per year. In reality, you may well have different expected lifespans for different pieces of equipment, which can easily be taken into account to actually calculate the annual cost there. In this example then, overhead costs are imagined to be £1,000 per square metre, and our facility of 100 square metres provides £100,000 per year, and totalling that all up gives us £296,000 of relevant costs for that service, shared across the 36,500 units that we can sell, provides us with that price of £8.13 per cage per week. Next slide, please. And this is simply just a comparison. So generally the stocking density of a cage is 2.5. So this is the exact same scenario, but the mouse capacity is 2,500 if you filled all those 1,000 cages, which breaks down to a planned capacity of 70% of that being 1,750. Here we're working in days, so together that's 638,750, which if we share our costs across that gives us a price of 46 pence per mouse per day. This illustrates, I think quite effectively, that with these things, often pennies make a big difference. And they'll make a big difference to the facility, but also to the users of the facility, depending on their funding situation. Next slide, please. So this is the approach that we take for our cost recovery, and it's reviewed on an annual basis, so that we keep those costs reflecting the fact that salaries go up each year, for example, and inflationary costs externally are still being recovered. But there are a number of challenges to cost recovery in this way. One is that the planning capacity is not always achieved. So that's not such a problem for variable costs, where they are very directly proportionate to the number of units of services sold, but it does often leave a shortfall on fixed costs. I guess we're fortunate as a university that can be planned for and taken into account for the wider university. The same methodology doesn't always apply to all the services. So, for example, we're not able to use that track methodology for recovering the costs of animal procurement. So the time that is spent by our staff on actually procuring animals from external suppliers, arranging imports, exports, and all the logistics that goes along with that. So that can cause some confusion for users. There are a number of assumptions that are needed in this model, which can hinder the transparency of those costs, but ultimately it's important for the sustainability of the facilities that we need to have some basis for making these calculations. So those can sometimes be challenged, sometimes with good cause, sometimes with perhaps a lack of understanding. And one of the prime challenges for us is that not all funders will fund at the full economic cost. So charities, for example, do not often do not wish to fund equipment, infrastructure, or building depreciation from the overhead side or in the equipment replacements side. So that can, in some cases, affect the achievement of cost recovery for UCL as an institution. But more often it does mean that we are charging a lower rate to many of those funded by those sources. And I suppose it's apt to say as well that the pandemics do have an impact as well. So any sharp changes in utilisation of the facilities will have a sharp impact on the achievement of cost recovery, and that is not always due to the top point about fixed costs. That is not always possible then to actually recover costs on that basis. Thank you very much for your time. That's me.
Thank you very much, Jamie. So we'll crack on and move on to, so I'd like to introduce Monica, who's currently the partnerships lead for Breathe HDRUK Hub, and is working on several global respiratory and e-health innovation projects at the University of Edinburgh's Usher Institute. And there's a slightly different perspective, but again, around the same theme. So over to you. Thank you.
Lovely, thanks Phil, and hi everybody. Yeah, certainly am coming in at this a very different angle, and I'm delighted to be here to actually share with you. And what I'm going to do is talk through some of the processes that we're trying to work at to get to a sustainability model. Never has data been so important, and I think the two previous speakers have sort of alluded to their impact with COVID on their own work, but actually obviously with COVID, data has become so important. But even before this, Andrew Morris on his launch of the Data Hub said, his quote was, without data, it's like driving at night without headlights. You know, we need data in the health service, and we need data to transform the health service. So the next slide, please. I'm going to do a build here and see if this works, because I want to try and explain to you about the hub and how we work. The first thing is that the money that came for these hubs was allocated last year, so we were into the end of our first year, and it was a bidding process, and the money actually comes from the Industrial Strategy and Challenge Fund, along with UKRI, which gives an emphasis that actually this is about innovation. It's about innovation across the health service and how we can improve the health service with use of data, but it's also looking at how we work with industries, and that's not just the pharmaceutical industry, but other industries who've got an interest in data. So that could be imaging, it could be wearable devices, to actually really bring regeneration into the UK. We're a consortia, which makes life really complicated. And just picking up the comments from before about having one university with its, cost recovery and processes, we actually work with several universities, and everybody has slightly different ways of doing this. The main grant holder is Edinburgh through the Usher Institute. And it's always these things that are quite, it's interesting, you go for a grant and it's fantastic, but you have a grant. And at the end of the day, we're working with researchers who now have to find a way to get sustainability at the end of the 3 years. So we were lucky enough to be afforded £5 million, as with the other, the 7 of the hubs. And each of the hubs work very differently. They have an emphasis on different clinical aspects. So there's one called Insight, which is in more fields, it's looking at eye care. There's one called Gut Reaction, which, no surprise, is actually looking at clinical conditions around the gut. There's another one called DataCan, etc. Ours is called Breathe, and that means that obviously we're in the area of respiratory disease. If you could click on, please, Roberto. We're structured in a very different way. So what is a data hub? Well, obviously, one thing is that we we have access to data, and we either have access to data ourselves, or we're working with others to pull data into a trusted research environment, which can then be repurposed for clinical studies, for researchers, for the NHS. And that data comes from many, many different sources. It's not just from NHS clinical data. For instance, during COVID, we've been involved with the Zoe Zoe tracker coming out of King's, and we've been hosting that data, and that data has been repurposed for many, many studies. We're divided into sort of 3 clinical themes. One is around drug discovery, and some of you will know Martin and Ian from Nottingham, Leicester. We've got a real world evidence theme, which is more around epidemiology, which is led by Jenny and Chris. And then we have both digitally enabled but also data driven clinical trials. Can you click again, please? HDR, as I say, HDRUK is our is the overarching cluster where we all sit under. Click again, please. And we had right from the beginning some industrial partners. So they were our founding partners. But as I say, part of this is to bring more industrial partners into Breathe as we move along. And as I alluded to earlier, when you start thinking about where data sits, it's right across all kinds of different industries, from very small startup industries and SMEs to large pharma companies. Click again, please. And one of the big things, and I think today we're talking about transparency, and that's obviously about funding, but the big drive for us is about, you know, all the issues that can go wrong with data as far as a public persona. So a big drive behind all the data hubs is how we involve the public and the publics. Lay leads, we have 2 lay leads, but we also work with charities in this space. And that's a really important thing to us, and really important when it comes to our costing models and being transparent about our costing models. And one thing I will touch on, and perhaps we'll come back to this, is value. It's, again, with our 2 previous speakers, it's actually understanding the value of what we're actually providing, the value of data. And there's a lot of public persona out there about the fact that data should be free to access, it's free for everybody. Why should there be any sort of thoughts about charges for data? And I'll come back onto that one in a moment. So if we can move on to the next slide, please. I hope that sets the scene. So the rationale behind us developing this commercial, trying to develop a commercial framework is yes, and it is a 3-year grant. And obviously we've been sidetracked like everybody else over the last 6 to 9 months since COVID raised its head, and have wavered all sorts of things to actually, all sorts of costings and activities have really just been focused on getting data out and looking at the COVID situation. But we do have a clock ticking, and we're just entering our 2nd year. And the expectation is that we find sustainability in these hubs in some way or another by the end of those 3 years. So now it is really very much exercising our thoughts as to how we do that. Obviously there are commercial arrangements, but everything that we do has to serve the public interest. And our lay leads, and we work very closely with SAIL, which is our trusted research environment in Swansea, and they have a very open process about any activities that we undertake, any grants that we get, any requests for data, all goes through a very open scrutiny with the public. So working with commercial companies, we have that exactly right at the front of everything that we're doing. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Thank you. If we were starting on this, and I think this is quite an interesting learning, and I know many of you will, you're in very different situations. Some of you will come from a complete commercial background, and this will not be rocket science to you. Some of you that might work in universities, this is a very different way of beginning to think, because living from grant to grant is one way of, many universities do that, and it's common practice, and we get through this one, there will be something over the horizon. But for this, we didn't sit down because it was a grant application. We did not sit down with any pre-planning. So if you were going to start a business tomorrow, you would have a business model, you'd have to go to the bank, and you'd have to go to your venture capitalist, and you'd have to have that all, you know, obviously laid out in front of you. And yes, a grant is a grant, and you have to do a lot of work to get the money for a grant, but it's a very different perspective. It's more about, you know, aspirations, it's about the academic prowess, it's about obviously what we're going to do with the data, but actually having a business model was not on the table at all. And then you also have to think about, well, this is our business model, what is it that we're actually offering, and what is the wraparound that we can offer, but therefore what is our operating model? How will we operate? We've got 6 different academic institutions, we've got an NHS trust, we've got all these industrial partners. How are we actually going to operate as and what services will we provide? And then in comes the costing model. So how will we provide that? And yeah, I can't underestimate the complexity of actually trying to pull all of this together, even on a day-to-day for costing out projects, but thinking of the long term, what this will look like for sustainability. Next slide, please. So let me tell you about our journey so far, because I'm here to sort of share warts and all, what we've been thinking of, and you know, hopefully provoke some discussion. So as I say, this was a grant, so there was no business case, and we started from ground zero. Okay, it's nice to get a grant, which is fantastic, but actually, you know, we're thinking now for the 3 years ahead of us, and how we're going to operate. Next one, please. Next build, please, Roberta. Thank you. So the challenging, you know, the challenges that are arising for us are these multiple universities and settings, and all the different approaches that they have to commercial ventures. Some universities are far more risk averse than other universities, and actually what would this look like at the end? If it was within one university, it might be complex with thinking about setting up some kind of enterprise outside of one university, but there being 6 universities, you know, this is something that we're going to have to try to figure out. What is the anchor at the end of the day? Does it remain within one university setting? Do we set up a social enterprise? And going through all those different pros and cons of what this business model will look like. It's a pretty short time, because at the moment, you know, work has been concentrated on bringing in partners, making us successful, working with both academics, with bringing data into Breathe, but also working with our commercial partners, and also working out how the business model will work. There was no prep work at all. There was no market research. There was none of all the things that as I said to you before, if we were starting out with a commercial business. So I'm sure some of my commercial friends out there are thinking, oh my goodness, this is crazy. And then what is it that we're selling? Do you sell data? No, we clearly do not sell data, but what we sell is data services. What we have on offer is the wrap around the data. So, you know, it's making data more available and accessible, but also repurposing that in a way, combining data, federating data, finding data sources, explaining, you know, about data, understanding coding, all of that wraps around the actual data source. Next one, please. And the steps that we have taken so far is actually talking to the institutions that we're working with, looking at the business development side of those universities, so not necessarily the guys that are actually directly involved in the grant, but their business teams within those other universities, and looking at universities that have done a lot more of different kinds of enterprises or taken different kind of risk. And we've drawn on lots of other resources that have been helped us with the market. As such, we have some colleagues who've set up something called HDRUK, which is up in Scotland, which is in the Lothian area of integrated primary secondary care data, completely funded through a different stream. And we're working very closely with them to look at the model that they're using. Next slide, please. And the first click, thank you. So the things we have to consider, and this is really quite difficult, and it's HDRUK are very good at bringing us all together. So the commercial leads do all come together. And I think it's been a fantastic environment up until now. Often you'll find that if you're in a competitive environment, people will not expose what they're doing and sharing. But this has been fostered in a very different way. So we are sharing, we're testing, we're working through different ways of, sorry, there's just been Sorry, a bird just hit the window and it's injured outside my window. Really sorry, guys. So it's got to be we've got to think about, I'm sorry, I completely lost my thread there. So I just have to this is about doing these things at home. So we have to look at not pricing ourselves outside of the market. So what I was going to say is that we are making comparisons with each other in the sense that we are doing things in a similar way. Not necessarily at this moment exposing costs to each other, but I think that will come. And because we are funded in the way that we're funded, there is a drive for us to actually put our costs eventually and publicly make those available. The complexity of multiple shareholders. I mean, we're trying to sort out so many people that are that have got a stake in this. Next up, lessons learned so far. Progress is really slow. Don't underestimate the time that any of this will take. Preparation is key, and if we could turn back the clock and work out the research, do the market research, business plan in advance, that would have been a lot more helpful. But we're doing it now, and we're really on the right track. Start small and work from there to approach these tasks, because otherwise it just feels so mammoth, it feels impossible. But I think we are making good steps, and we've certainly worked out our costing model as far as cost recovery and what that looks like. It's the bigger, longer sustainable ability we haven't yet. And bringing good people. We've recently recruited somebody with business development skills into the team, which is really helpful for us. And then finally, I just wanted to show the two, and I'm not going to go into this in too much detail, but if I could have the next slide, and you can look at this perhaps later, but trying to think about, there are two different ways of actually generating income. One is what we've heard before is about, the sort of service-based model, the cost recovery model, which is the safe model. So I provide a service, whatever that service is, and in return there is a cost, and you can work out your costing model, but it's for return for a transaction. The ones that actually are potentially more risky but will give much more potential funding in the long run is actually to have something outcomes based. And this is really a risk, more on that risk end, to think about, if you were to work with industry and you could see by providing a service in some way that would accelerate development of a product, whether that is a pharmaceutical product, whether that's a data product in some case, whether it's a wearable. Actually, if you accelerate that, is there any kind of potential saving to the company, and therefore could that be profit shared within Breathe? Or even the biggest step, and these are the ones that we start to think this is risky, but we have to think about all options, is there actually down the end of the line an IP and a potential for something that becomes a product that then gives a constant return on investment? And all the hubs are pretty safe on the other side. I think we're all looking at the service base because that's where we're quite comfortable. But on the outcome based end, this is where we've got to start stretching ourselves and thinking outside the box. And I think if you move on, that might be my last slide. So thank you. And I'm just going to go pick that bird up outside. So I'll be back in one quick minute. Sorry, folks. Thank
you, Monica. And for all the events we've done, that is now a new one on me in terms of things going wrong. But thank you. You handled that very well. We're now going to move on to a panel session. So I think we're going to stop sharing the slides, and that'll bring all the panel members up. And so if the panel members could also switch their cameras on as well, so we are visible to everybody. Brilliant. Jamie, I've just seen your background.
Yeah, I'm not sure what's going on there.
The transparent background has gone wrong. And also just to thank Alison for joining us on the panel. Alison's going to represent the biobank community here, and she is the operations director now at the Wales Cancer Bank. So thank you for joining. So the first question I want to pick up on is around what are the expectations in terms of transparency of cost, and I'll direct that at Joe first around what would you expect to see, and then maybe to Jamie afterwards around what your experiences have been in that regard as well.
Thanks, Phil. I think it would be useful to, from our perspective, to understand the constraints that the industry face. I think we have such a range of prices put forward to us, whether it's malaria, whether it's COVID, whether it's onchocerciasis, whether it's a program specifically to source samples from scratch, whether it's a residual sample, and then everything in between, and the level of information and data you can achieve with that. And at the moment, it's quite fragmented. So having maybe a central repository or coordinator that, if you like, can review the costs of all these various models that have been presented today would help partners be able to see, okay, well, this is perfectly reasonable given the circumstances. For example, something Jamie mentioned, which I hadn't thought of course, is the impact of non-COVID research being halted, how that would have impacted their work. And of course, we know from our clinical trials that anything that wasn't COVID related was stopped. So those would be, I think, the minimum, if you like, in terms of transparency that would be useful. Just having a seal of approval from someone whose role it is to coordinate and know across the different partners.
Yeah, so Jamie, have you had that experience where people have questioned the costs and then you've been able to show them and explain it in that way?
Yes, so in fact, I think it was 2 or 3 years ago, we went through a review of our cost recovery structure, which is where many of these discussions around what the cost drivers are came from, and how that the actual price that is charged to our users was derived. So what we found was that starting from quite a low level of understanding of what's actually driving the costs for us was meaning that users were challenging more regularly, and actually by being proactive and open to challenge, that has reduced the number of challenges. It's reassured, I think, the user community that these are the genuine costs, and built that understanding, so that now we're in a position where there is that understanding and shared understanding of what's driving the costs, so we can talk about, these things are happening that are changing things, and focus on what's different, whereas we really had to start from quite the ground level up a couple of years ago.
And Monica, do you find in those early days of setting up the hub that there's maybe a nervousness from academia to talk about cost and to talk about charging and the service element there? Is that part of what we get over?
I think that's right, and it's absolutely a cultural thing, Phil. There, to be fair, it's not something that academics normally want to talk about. It's kind of something somebody else talks about that, or somebody else in the university does. But we have to do it, and it's actually being clear on what it is. And our patient and public involvement has been fantastic in here. I thought that was going to cause some of the issues, but the team that we've got have been really good at this, because if I give you an example, the sort of thing where we were, taking a lot of time on and not, even beginning to think about costs, is when somebody comes to you with a vague idea of what they want to do. So I want to use data to, look at a care pathway across the NHS from primary care to secondary care, and they have no idea how to get there. And then you have to go through several conversations about what they clearly want to do, what they want to find out. Then we have to go through looking at the different coding, where they might get the data. Well, you've spent hours on that, and then actually somebody might turn around and say, well, I don't know, that's too much, or oh no, that's not what I want to do now, or I've now got all the answers, I could go somewhere else and try and find that. So there is something about all of this where, and I think as academics we tend to want to give it all. We give all this for, that's, you're interested in what I'm doing, therefore I'm giving all this. But actually, if you're trying to develop a commercial model, how do you factor in some of that? So actually the way to factor that in, because I think it's not fair to say, oh, well, we're going to charge you for perhaps consultative services that never go anywhere, is then try to recover that cost on future projects, because you've got to factor those costs in somewhere.
Yeah, and so moving over to Alison, in terms of the biobanking community, obviously how biobanks are actually set up, how they're currently funded, varies greatly between different biobanks. Therefore, what somebody quotes as a cost might not actually be the true cost. And have you had experiences where people have said, wow, you're expensive, or wow, given that reaction because of that diversity that's around?
Yeah, I think you're quite right. The way a biobank is set up is really going to inform what is included in their cost recovery. So if they have a lot of support from their institution, there may be an awful lot of costs that they don't need to recover, so things like estates, electricity, things that are just part of the university or hospital estate, but others will. So whereas I am all for standardization, I think it's kind of difficult to come up with a pricing structure that all biobanks or a lot of biobanks will be able to buy into, just because we're all working in different ways and have different costs to recover. So yes, I mean, we've had mixed reactions. We've had reactions of, no, that's way too expensive. And we kind of moved away from saying it was a cost recovery fee. We have now changed the language slightly to say that we are charging for the service, because we were getting a lot of people saying, well, I only want a tube of blood. A tube costs £1. Why are you charging me £25 for it? So we were trying to get the thought that actually it's the service, and it's just what Monica was just saying. It's all the work that goes in behind it. It's the ethics, it's the regulatory, it's the staff time. So you're not actually paying for that tube of blood. You're paying for everything that goes behind it. And I think that's what's important to try and get over. And I did like Amir's phrase yesterday about being reassuringly expensive. I'm not sure that necessarily works across the piece, because some people will not like that reassurance. But yeah, it's hugely different. And some people will say, no, that's way too expensive. And other people will just go with it quite happily. So it's so difficult to know.
Yeah, and I guess for yourself, Jo, that must be quite hard as someone that doesn't necessarily understand all these complexities. When somebody quotes really quite a small amount, say £5 to £10, but somebody's quoting £1,000 a sample, there may be some very genuine reasons behind some of that, but it's just not transparent in terms of understanding why somebody can supply at one value and not another.
That's right. It's the knowledge asymmetry, really, which is the issue. And having some level of understanding, or having someone who is trusted that vets it, I think goes a long way. And then there's a separate conversation around what is needed at times of crisis as well. And I think it's fair to say that the access to samples has hindered certainly the UK response and the development of new tools. And we've got around it through different partnerships that we've been able to create. But had we not done that, there is no way we could have developed anything meaningfully validated or useful to contribute to the pandemic. And it seems like a bit like the effort to prepare, for example, for an epidemic, or with some infections that disproportionately affect some groups and others, like influenza with the young and the elderly and those with chronic conditions. You have a culture now of bringing patients into randomized controlled trials where possible in the NHS. And that's been, I think, one of the most brilliant NHS legacies, where the forward planning has meant that is standard. And I do wonder if there's anything that can be done similarly on the biobanking, where you are able, just like we've seen the UK biobanks and the genomic institutes that are being set up, to really make a meaningful contribution and bring those prices down and make it more routine. We've seen, maybe one last point on that, outside the UK, even in a country called, in Senegal, in West Africa, where the Institut Pasteur de Dakar is the national reference laboratory, despite no one supporting their biobank in a meaningful way, they have created one that is a public good. And they have samples dating back to the 60s, which allowed them to, for example, make the clear documentation that Zika was present in Africa long before it spread across Latin America and the Polynesian Islands. And I think these kind of resources are undervalued, and more transparency and more sharing like you're doing here, I think will elevate its appreciation and I hope investment down the line.
Yeah, and a question that's come in as well is around really the infrastructure, and so whether if we're having to cost recover the investment that goes in just to set up the infrastructure, that obviously adds quite a bit of cost there. So so there's maybe a question initially to Jamie around that. I mean, when you're cost recovering, are you having to cost recover that initial investment, or is it purely the running cost going forward?
So I think, like Alison said, that's down to an institution's choice. So in our cost recovery model, we are trying to ensure that we are sustainable, that we are maintaining a certain level. However, significant investments do come into the department from the university to really make that step change in terms of what we are able to offer. So it's not it's not a feature of the cost recovery necessarily, but elements of it may be. And similarly, funders would view it that way for us, where if they are supporting a purchase of a particular piece of equipment, they would expect that not to be that investment to be recognised in the ongoing price as well. So it does become quite a complex model, and it's again down to the institution how they react to that.
And to follow that on with Alison and Monica, then in terms of the cost recovery that you're operating, or the services that you're charging for, is that an aspect that's also in the mind, not just to kind of cover the current maintenance of the current infrastructure, but how you think about reinvesting? So almost running at a surplus so that you've got a capacity to reinvest later. Is that's part of your plan in there as well?
I mean, as I said earlier, I mean, absolutely, but we're fortunate enough to have had a grant to start this work, and so we've got that buffer. And I think it was a very interesting question to ask earlier, because it's almost a phony cost recovery, because it's not a true cost recovery. Because if you were starting out a commercial business, you would actually have to either take a loan out, or have a venture capitalist or someone who's going to put that investment in the first place, and there would be some kind of expectation that you were recovering those costs as well as the day-to-day cost recovery. And I think we do live in a little bit of a cushioned field in academia, in the sense, and Jamie, that's not meant to be any kind of criticism, but I think there is that, you've sort of alluded to that, and I think wearing that little bit of a safety net, but actually taking that out. My models now are beginning to look at, what does it look like? What would this entity be? Will it be a spin-off from the universities? Will it be a separate entity? And then that is when people start to get a little bit concerned, because your costs then start to go in a completely different direction. But on the other hand, you then don't have all the other levies that come in from the university and all the complexities about how money flows around universities. So there are pros and cons of both models. And you have to operate in those models in which you're operating at the time. But breaking out of that, and going out and spinning off is a different, different thing.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I mean, I think one of the biggest constraints that we have at the moment is operating within the university financial system. So whereas, yes, we bring money in, but if I don't use it within the year I bring it in, I lose it. So I have no option to build up a buffer. So you could argue that actually sustainability is completely impossible working with the financial model that we do. So yes, I think you do have to then start looking at spin-outs, at can you commercialize parts of it, which doesn't necessarily sit well with a lot of people who have set up biobanks in academia. That wasn't the rationale behind setting them up. But I think we really have to look at this balance of, if we want to get anywhere near sustainability, and again, it comes back to what your definition of sustainability actually is, then certainly with the financial model that I have to work with at the moment, it's completely impossible.
And I think it's a really key point around the infrastructure, particularly research infrastructure in the UK, because I mean, as the Tissue Directory and Coordination Centre, we are effectively a research project of the University of Nottingham and University College London. And so we have exactly the same constraints, and we get asked the same questions about our own sustainability, but we are within a university system. And that is as if we knew the questions were coming, but there's one that has come in around actually would it be better to have a system where biobanks aren't part of universities and categorize them in some other different way? And I was interested, Joe, in what you said earlier around some of these companies that are developing vaccines deliberately for markets and having that cost low and always reinvest in it. And so, you know, do you think that could be something that biobanks could look to do to have that type of model in place?
I think it's a model worth looking at. And the reason we did it from our experience was precisely because of the constraints of both of these sectors, the academia sector and the private limited company structure. And by having a company limited by guarantee, it's allowed Global Access Diagnostics to take in grants where appropriate to offset and de-risk some of its work, but also to take in highly concessional loans from impact investors who are looking at that bottom line with a different metric alongside that cost recovery. So it could be interesting for biobanking because, say in our field, in diagnostic development and validation, I think one of the huge challenges and great values is head-to-head evaluations, comparing one product with another on exactly the same samples, same standards, so you can make meaningful interpretations. And really all you need is just slightly higher volume of the same sample. But you can bring in multiple parties, multiple companies, multiple institutions that are investing in these products. And that is one area that you can perhaps see the role of biobanking as a service as well. We have seen millions, literally, of dollars be poured into some of these head-to-head studies, and only a handful of companies have been selected to do that. So I think there's a huge gap there. And as a company limited by guarantee gives you that full flexibility. So any money you keep doesn't have to be reinvested that year. It's not a charity, but it does have to go into that mission, whatever is in your article of association.
And Monica, what's the long-term plans for the hubs then? If they're going to be sustainable, is it to be sustainable within the universities in year 4? What's the?
I think that is, I mean, we've got different options and they're all on the table at the moment as to whether that does become. And, you know, at the moment we're a consortium of universities, so which university would become, because although Edinburgh holds the grant at the moment and it's divvied between the others, that may not be the model. It could be that it is a spin-off from one of the are some of the universities more flexible on those spin-offs than others? And my take is yes, they are. Some are more supportive, so we're actually having discussions with all of the universities around that and looking at different models as to what they like and look like. The other hubs are all in very different positions, and some of those are focused within an acute trust, and that brings its own issues, but also other some benefits, but also negative. All of these have different, and you have to work within those circumstances you're in. So watch this space. I'll come back in 3 years and tell you, Phil.
Come back in 3 months. That'd be more helpful. And actually on Thursday we've got a session where we're wanting everybody to redesign the whole ecosystem, so to not be defined by what is the current setup.
Yeah. If
we were to do this with a blank piece of paper, how would we design it so we can get fair access to samples, but to remove and to have that transparency built in? Because this leads a little bit to what I was saying yesterday about our effort at the moment is retrospective in terms of coordination. And for us, it's hard to retrospectively coordinate once the funding's awarded, once the structure's in place, once the consent is taken, and once the ethics in place. We're quite bound by what those permissions allow. And so how would we redesign what we're trying to do at the moment? I think it's a really important point of all of this. And
it's really interesting, Phil, sorry to interrupt you, but there are so many parallels from, and it is, when I was first invited to come to speak today, I was thinking, what's the connect? There are so many parallels in data, because there are private data, CROs that are doing some bits of this work. There are trusted research environments being set up by independent, organisations. The NHS has got a view in this. It has got so many parallels. And as you say, it'd be great just to sort of take all that away and say, what is it? It goes back to, your business model. What does it look like? Where do we want to get to? And try to work through that and then try and make things fit. At the moment, I think we've got square pins and round holes or whatever. And we're trying to make a bit like this. And perhaps we need to get a little bit of blue sky thinking.
Yeah, and to Alison and Jamie, have you experienced the situation that someone's described, where it's essentially a bit of a vicious loop, where somebody will say you're too expensive, therefore you're not used, but the next time obviously you then have to recover the costs that haven't happened over the last couple of months because people said you're more expensive, and therefore your costs are always going up. You know, that, have you experienced that loop where you're up against others that are supplying them not at cost, you're trying to supply them at cost, but that actually means you get used less, and that just loops? Have you experienced that much, or is that? And any tips? Was the main switch there, Alison, in terms of referencing yourself as a service, and these are what we offer you, other than just the sample?
Yeah, I think it probably, it certainly helped, because it took the focus away from that is just a tube that you're giving us with blood in. So I think it really did help to focus the attention on what the service was behind it. So not only that they didn't have to go out and fill out the IRAS form, that they didn't have to write up information sheets and consent forms. There's a huge amount of a researcher's time that would go into designing a collection, on a standalone collection, that they just don't have to do. And I think quite often people don't think about the time that they invest in doing these things. They literally look at consumables. You know, how much is that tube? So I think it probably has helped. I think also now researchers are maybe becoming a little more used to costing things into their grants, knowing that there will be costs, in the same way that there have been costs for animal work over the last so many years, that actually human biosamples are no different, that they do need to cost that in. So I think the culture is changing slightly. I think we've still got a way to go, but it is about maybe more understanding of what goes into the sample collections, and not just the sample itself.
I say from our point of view, yeah, we absolutely have taken a similar vein in terms of communication, to focus on the service and the outcomes of that service, rather than breaking it down into exactly this is what our costs you're paying for. In terms of actually the impact on whether that's affected our utilisation, internally we have a bit of a captive audience, I suppose, which means that there are benefits to people utilising us, and we haven't experienced that in the same way that you might in the biobanks.
And actually, I mean, this could also be one of the key points. I mean, I find it always quite interesting, the differences between animal research and human research. And actually, you know, it's much harder, if not impossible, for somebody to set up their own new animal facility for their project, whereas it's really quite possible for somebody to start up their own biobank and collect samples from humans without much effort. And so then when we talk about sustainability of resources and sustainability of infrastructure, we don't have the same playing field. And when we talk about transparency of reporting, if you do the research fish submission, when you have to actually, it's a mandatory part around the use of animals in research, but it's not a mandatory part of humans in research. And so, you know, I don't know why that's materialized. It might be because of different pressure groups where, you know, there might be some aspect there, but it's just interesting that the domains in some ways are very similar and trying to do a very similar thing, but actually how they've been set up is very different. And have you experienced that, Alison, where somebody has said, you're too expensive, I'm just going to do it myself then?
We've had, there is a group or two who have set up their own collections. They haven't necessarily cited expense as, or maybe expense is a contributing factor, but maybe not the whole reason for doing it. I mean, it is, as you know, it's a particular bugbear of mine that collections can be set up quite so easily without reference to, can you actually get the samples from a biobank, from an existing biobank? There is no point setting up endless new collections if the samples that are already in biobanks aren't being used. That doesn't lead to anybody's sustainability. So I think you're right. The way that the system works has almost come about by accident for biobanks. There was never anything really put in place specifically for biobanking. We came along and started off on the back of clinical trials, and then we came out of that as far as ethics were concerned. So I think that there's never really been an infrastructure that has been specifically for biobanking. We've always had to try and fit into or around others that doesn't necessarily give the best outcome.
I was on mute there, sorry. Yeah, no, I agree with that. I think it's grown organically, and there's never been that infrastructure focus. So I guess then a question to everybody, if we do want to start setting this up, who pays for it? I mean, where do we start? Do you think it's something that we need to be going to the research councils for, the government for? Do you think there would be interest in things like Gates Foundation or these endeavours that might see this as the greater good to try and get some investment to then facilitate some of these vaccine developments and things like this? Where do people see that coming from? Where should we be? Whose door should we knock on to see how we can change the dynamic?
Could I raise a point first? Because I think it has again, it transcends both of us in the sense of what's the public opinion on this? Because I mean, that's a really big thing that will influence where you go and lobby in a sense. I mean, it's because it's so important that I don't think the general public, like they do with health data, understand about biobanks and the importance. COVID has done that, at least has done that. And I think people have seen where maybe this can accelerate for the greater good. And some of the things Jo has raised are so important to get that ethical perspective involved. So before we go to where do we go knocking on the door, it's actually engaging and having this dialogue. And I'm not sure how much your world opens this up to the public and has public engagement. But I mean, we gain so much by having that PPIE as part of our ethos and work. So I would throw that one in for a starter.
I agree with that. Yeah, I think it's a really important point that we do need to make sure there's that voice there as well to drive it, because I think that can be an effective one for change as well, not just...
Absolutely, and for political change, the patient's voice, and the public's voice is very strong, to have that as part of your lobbying process is really important.
Yeah, any other comments?
On the question of who should pay, I think it really should follow on what we're trying to achieve. And when it comes to epidemics, either emerging or existing epidemics, whether they're neglected or high burden, it's clear that there's a huge mismatch between that cost of inaction or the benefit that you would have from having a better system that could improve the tools that could reduce those burdens with what we're seeing at the moment. And as I showed on that slide of everything we're working on, we struggle with every single one of those, and it's the same problems. It's the current system prices it in a certain way. We don't have the budget to meet all that, the sourcing for the whole programs. And if we don't and others can't afford it, it's not developed, let alone in terms of pricing at the end of the product or the service. We want to keep the price as low as possible, because even though the value might be very high, if you like, that value-based pricing only often benefits a smaller number. So what we want to do is just make it as accessible and as wide as possible, and be as prepared as possible so we can just move forward. So when it comes to yellow fever, for instance, you often want to have everything ready so that if there's an epidemic or an outbreak, you can deploy your technology and validate it and access samples in that instance. But those are obviously rare and sporadic, and ensuring we have a shared biobank where it really is a public good, I think could be tremendously helpful. And if that's the case and it's a public good and it's delinked from private return, that does rest often on support from governments and on philanthropies. And so seeing as this is shared, I would view it as worthy and worth going to those government departments and philanthropies making that case. I think it's strong enough. I think it's cross-cutting and enabling to every single product that is developed down the line. And at the moment, it's really working with direct partners and direct links that have delivered in the past that I think is the only way things are going to continue, certainly from our experience.
Yeah, no, thank you. Any other comments? Nope. Well, I'd like to thank you very much for being on the panel. We have sparked quite a bit of debate on the Hoover app as well. So I think there's some specific questions for yourself there, Joe, some more general comments on there. So if you do have time just to log in and answer some of those questions, that would be great. Thank you very much, everybody, for attending. For tomorrow, just a reminder for everybody to do their homework. So this is to look at the consent forms that we've uploaded. It's not a big task that we're asking you to do. It's just to pull out from your topic area the concepts that have been explored in those consent forms. And what we're really looking to do is to see how we can draw together potentially a common consent form based on what everybody has. So it just needs a quick read, look over the digest and pull out some of those concepts and stick them into the chat for that community that you're involved with. Tomorrow as well, because we're breaking everybody into breakout groups, if you can log into Zoom, so if you have a Zoom account, it will make Emma's life a lot easier if you log into Zoom before you join. Otherwise, she has to individually add you to the breakout rooms one by one, whereas if you log in, it will automatically do it for her. So if you can do that, we'll have one less stressed Emma to have. So if you could do that, that would be brilliant. Remember also to check out the exhibitor profiles. There is a quiz where you have to have found some information on their profiles to then be able to answer the questions. And that's it from us today. We have got the session at 4 o'clock as well again, where you can just kind of informally drop in and talk to everybody, just have some chat about what's been happening today. And thanks very much and see you all tomorrow. Thank you.